Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you, sir. I rise on behalf of New Zealand First in support, only at this stage, of this large omnibus bill entitled Taxation Annual Rates for 16-17 Closely Held Companies and Remedial Matters Bill. I know, it's a beautiful title, but it does speak to the frustration some of us have on this side of the House, Mr Speaker, when we keep having these remedial bills put in front of us. And I say to Mr McIndoe and the New Zealand public that these remedial pieces of legislation should cause the New Zealand public some great concern, especially under that national government. Here the government, Mr Speaker, will be making over, well, as far as I've had the chance to count, I've had some amazing frustration at the pace that this bill's been presented to the opposition parties, and then suddenly it's in the House, frustrating my genuine endeavours to make a thorough and full analysis of the material before us. But from what I've been able to count, over 50 changes to amendments across 7 pieces of legislation ranging from the Income Tax Act of 2007 to the Stamp and Cheque Duties Act 1971. And I want to add to the words of my colleague from the Labour Party who spoke quite eloquently about the ad hoc nature of this piece of legislation. And in fact, I suppose echo the words of the co-leader of the Green Party there when we say, where is the direction, where is the understanding that the New Zealand public is supposed to take from pieces of legislation like this, especially with regards to hugely important issues that are defining the world around us and certainly defining the nature of the national government and their lack of action thus far around tax issues and avoidance. This, for me, sir, has come onto the order paper, and I just noted that it took just a couple of weeks to get into the House, which is unusual. It sat at the very end. But I do want to acknowledge that whilst I may not have had the time to do my normal consultation with friends in the accounting field and lawyers, I do acknowledge some of the words of Mr Bishop, who gave one of his better contributions of late around the no, it's not a high mark, around the GTTP process used. So in reading the impact statements, you do get an understanding of the consultation that the officials have undertaken in coming to the House with the legislation as it sits thus far. There was comprehensive consultation. I say that with reservations because, for example, there's tax legislation in here that relates to councils, but only the Auckland Council was consulted, and so you have to wonder how robust the feedback was in terms of what will the nature of those changes mean for council-run, state-held entities. So it's complicated. I think everyone in the House has acknowledged that, and I do acknowledge that the consultation with the community thus far has been, to a degree, comprehensive. But that is why New Zealand First is offering its provisional support at this stage of the debate anyway, because from here we're able to go to the Select Committee and have not only officials but our public, our experts out there come to the House and give us feedback. And I know without any doubt whatsoever there will be a large array of issues that will need tidying up. The last piece of legislation, tax legislation anyway, that came up before the House included components of the Bright Line legislation. So New Zealand First opposed that right from the start because we knew that it was a waste of time marketing spin. But this one, at least in our readings, does move us in the right direction. So I agree with the Minister's contribution. I do agree with Mr Bishop, which is unusual, that the tax system does need to be defined and made such that it is broadly fair and that the New Zealand public can have a good and kind of transparent understanding of their tax obligations. And the Ministry, the Inland Revenue and the Minister themselves talk about the issues around compliance becoming lesser if the public understand what their obligations are, and we fully concur. Unlike the last piece of legislation, which did the exact opposite, we believe at this stage that we're moving in the right direction. We do not believe that, and I don't think any amount of fast talking from the Minister on the ICT spend, which my understanding is from $1.2 to $1.6 billion on the IRD upgrade. I don't think he can justify those numbers just yet. That is an abhorrent number. That is frightening. I do not know why the New Zealand public have not rallied against 1.6 or 1.5, if you concede the government numbers, $1.5 billion in an ICT upgrade. But, you know, we do want a transparent tax system. The Minister will have a lot to answer for, and he'll have to answer to the opposition constantly for that spend, so we'll move from there. The piece, you'll note the theme from the contributors this afternoon. We managed to dig into some depth on at least one part of the over 50 changes. And I looked into the double tax agreements and the anti-avoidance rules, which I think Mr Shaw talked to, although I think I will, unlike Mr Shaw, acknowledge that the government is actually looking at the trust structures here and the companies in terms of their avoidance procedures, because I think what the government's acknowledging with this legislation, as I read it thus far, is that the DTAs, the double tax agreements, do not prevent anti-avoidance at this stage. It's a quote from the impact statement, the analysis itself, Mr Speaker. But what I will say is it's taken way too long to get to this point, to have this conversation about legislation around tax avoidance for these large multinational corporates, Mr Speaker. It has taken way too long for the government to get here. And to be fair, I'm not even satisfied at this point that the legislation as it stands will actually solve the problem, because at this stage it's a matter of degrees. And so the double taxation agreement will take precedence. There's been no case law to examine the issues around this at the moment, but I think we may still have some issues as we move forward unless the legislation there has changed. So New Zealand First has said that the tax settings need to be changed, and we look to Canada and Australia, for example, as early adopters or those who act quickly in acknowledging the issues with non-tax compliance with large multinationals. And I concede that there is work being done by the OECD where New Zealand does need to work in parallel with those efforts. But we have examples from around the world of governments acting unilaterally and not compromising those efforts and holding these big multinationals to account with regards to their tax compliance. That is what is fair and what is reasonable in undertaking business in our jurisdictions. So I do look forward to a comprehensive select committee process. I look forward to the committee of the whole. We here in New Zealand First have no doubt there will be much to debate. I just want to say again for the record, so it is clear, it is only at this stage that we support this piece of legislation so that we can get it through to the Select Committee, so that we can have meaningful, broad and robust debate on tax legislation that must go through that process. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Jamie